Hello, and welcome to the Mental Health Toolbox. I am Patrick Martin, your host and licensed psychotherapist, and today we'll be continuing the fundamental coping skills for depression, and specifically in this episode, I will be talking to you about communication skills. And just as a reminder, a lot of these skills that I've been covering in this series are derived from the works of Dr. Jean Miranda and her cohorts for cognitive behavioral skills for depression, specifically in the group modality. So today, I will be covering a few basics of communication skills and why communication is oftentimes a major obstacle in fostering healthy relationships. Okay, so in this video, I will be covering the following: communication as a common obstacle for creating and maintaining healthy relationships, as well as the different types of communication. And that's really important because oftentimes we tend to overcompensate, right, when we're trying to improve our communication skills. So we'll talk a bit about that. Also, how assertive communication is the most effective way for getting your needs met and also respecting the needs of others. We'll also be covering how we can learn to articulate and frame our thoughts and feelings using more assertive communication. That way we make sure we're heard and feel validated at the same time. And we're also going to be talking about the importance of identifying areas for potential growth within relationships, and most specifically our interpersonal skills. So what we do know is we can't change other people, but we can change our behavior, our own behavior. And oftentimes when we do that, other people's behavior will change by proxy. So we'll talk more about that, okay? So thank you so much for joining. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do make sure that you subscribe so you do not miss out on any more valuable content. And if you're watching this on YouTube, definitely click the notification bell, okay? If you're listening to this on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you get notified of all the new episodes coming out. All right, so let's start off by just talking about communication and why it is an obstacle in creating and maintaining healthy relationships, okay? And I'm sure as we dive into this, it'll become more apparent that regardless of the type of relationship that we have, communication is really the cornerstone of all healthy relationships, whether that's parent-child relationship, husband-wife, husband-husband, wife-wife, sibling, acquaintance, whatever the nature of the relationship is, employer-employee, it's a cornerstone. And the better we get at managing our communication and being very intentional with our communication, we can really apply that to all areas of our life, which is why I think it's probably the most important skill to have. They call it soft skill, but it's not really a soft skill. It's more of a life skill, okay? So as we move on, I think it's important also to mention that communication is not something that we are born with innately. It's not like we won some DNA lottery. It is a learned behavior, whether that be through modeling of parents or self-taught, right? Oftentimes as a therapist, I will say to people, we have to reparent ourselves sometimes as we get older. If we didn't have the best modeling growing up, it just means that you're going to have to do a little more work later on in life to figure out what works, right? Because what we learned growing up may not be effective in context, because the context changes as we get older. What used to work as a child may not work as well as an adult, and we'll talk more about that. So the majority of stress stems from relationships, at least in my experience in working with clients. We talk a lot about controlling our thoughts and controlling our emotions, but oftentimes what causes people the most distress is relationships. And that is a lot of reasons. Just top of mind, we get validation through relationships, right? And that's a big part of our self-esteem. And the other piece is that we cannot control other people, like I said a moment ago. So we can't control other people's behavior as much as we would like to. We can't force other people to change, and sometimes that leaves us feeling very helpless, especially if we depend on other people for validation. So a lot of the stress comes from relationships, right? Assumptions, conflict, of avoidance of confrontation. Arguments often become about defending accusations of ancillary issues, and participants lose sight of the nuclear events. So, meaning that oftentimes arguing becomes about arguing, and oftentimes the thing that causes people to argue from the beginning is not really addressed. And so the fighting just becomes about fighting. So we'll definitely talk about that. And the best method for heading this kind of issue off is to talk about active listening skills. So active listening is a subtle but powerful form of communication, and is a very powerful when it comes to talking about how we improve relationships. Okay, so let's talk about active listening for a minute. What is active listening? First of all, we have to talk about what it is and what it isn't, right? So active listening is not biting your tongue, chomping at the bit, and waiting for the other person to stop talking so that you can talk about your response. So you can express what you've been thinking about, how you want to respond to that person. So that's not active listening. That's just being impatient. Active listening is both verbal and nonverbal communication. Okay, so let's talk about the nonverbal for a second. Nonverbal active listening entails body language that communicates to the other person how you are feeling and also following along their train of thought, and that you're not just being distracted. Okay, so it's that intimate nonverbal communication that says, hey, I'm in tune with you, I'm following you, I'm painting a mental picture of what you're talking about so that I can better relate or empathize with what you are saying. That is active listening. Such nonverbal cues that elicit this understanding from the other person that you're in tune with them are things like eye contact, nodding of the head, right? Yes, I'm following you. I'm acknowledging what you're saying. These are forms of affirmation. A relaxed posture, not the arms crossed or distracted looks, but the relaxed posture that says, I'm present with you, okay? And physical proximity oftentimes shows that you're engaged with someone. If I'm engaged with you when you're talking, my body language is going to be more leaned in, like I'm trying to really hear what you're saying, as opposed to being kind of aloof and standoffish. So this could be leaning in, taking a step closer. You can, especially if you're starting the conversation or somebody approaches you at a distance, you physically walking towards them and getting a little more into their personal space is a way to show your intention that you're present and they have your full attention. But don't get too close, because some people, that might make them feel uncomfortable. So you kind of have to read the room on that. But enough to maintain a sense of privacy. So in terms of verbal communication and active listening, entails very little, really. It consists of mostly ahums, brief statements like I see, I understand, and once the other person has completed their thought, you will want to interject some reflective statements, right? So, and this is oftentimes, you can pick up on words they used, the last few things they said. You can circle back to something they touched on that was important in what they were sharing and ask more about that specific example. You can use other reflective statements like how interesting, or how did you know to blank in that circumstance, or how did you feel about blank or when that happened. These are statements of validation, and could also sound something very validating like, wow, that must have been really hard for you. How did you cope with that? And to do this from a very genuine place. And oftentimes when we talk about active listening, we're talking about empathy. So what I do as a therapist is oftentimes when I'm trying to relate to someone is I'll think about a specific experience I've had in my life that I can connect emotionally with, and then draw from that to try and understand what the other person is feeling in their experience, right? And we have to be careful, though, that we don't interject our own experience entirely on the other person, because how we cope with something may not be how they cope. So we use our own reflection as a way to empathize, but we want to be careful that we don't project, right? Or countertransfer. It's important. So some tips on that regard, some things you can look for to help you orient more easily to active listening and ensure that you provide effective feedback are the following. You want to observe the tone of body language of your counterpart and also yourself. You want to try and ascertain the dominant feeling that you're picking up from them. So they may be going through a range of feelings as they describe or talk to you, but you want to kind of pick up on the major ones, the most palatable feelings in the room. You also want to focus on what is expressed that you feel is of most important to them. So what are the themes that you're picking up on that you feel are most important to them? Are they repeating particular statements over and over again that you feel must really mean something if they're circling back or using the same kind of language? Okay, those are things you want to pick up on. And lastly, after your counterpart has completed their train of thought, it's ideal to elicit more information that you understand, that communicates that you understand what they've communicated. So it's making sure that you're not just making assumptions about what they're saying, but you really understand what they're saying. So it's seeking clarification. And this really mitigates the risk of misunderstandings, right? Which can have the opposite effect and have the other person feel invalidated and not understood. So it's perfectly okay to ask for clarification, or even if you've noticed that you drift off for a minute and say, I'm sorry I missed that last thing you said. I really want to make sure I understand you, which at first you might think, well, then they'll think I'm not listening, and that's not very validating. But it's quite the opposite. If you own that you drifted off or you didn't hear something they said, instead of pretending like you're following along, just be honest and say, I didn't catch that. So can you please repeat what you were saying, because it's really important that I understand what you're trying to express. Okay. People really respond well to that. All right. And using these simple and effective active listening skills really go a long way in fostering healthy relationships, and also developing that own habit within yourself about how to be a good listener, because it takes a lot of practice. And even as a therapist, it's something that I still have to be very cognizant of. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and it's not the same, going through the motions with every person. Active listening is an art, okay, more than a science. Others will find you more approachable also if you become good at active listening, because people gravitate toward good listeners. And the better you get at active listening, the easier it will be to kind of pick up on what people need. Some people just need to vent. Some people want practical feedback. Some people want advice. Some people want validation. So it's important to understand, and you'll get the feel for it the more you practice active listening, what a particular person is after, what they're trying to communicate. Okay? All right. Very good. Still with me? Excellent. So if you haven't subscribed by now, if you're finding this information helpful, please do. This is the exact kind of content that I seek to create for you, and it's actionable information. So things you can put into real life application. Okay, that's kind of my jam. So if it's your style, please do. Okay, so this brings us on to types of communication. So there are 3 types of communication, 3 basic types, and that is passive, assertive, and aggressive. All right, passive, assertive, and aggressive. And so we're going to talk about the 3. The sweet spot is assertive. So spoiler alert. We'll start off by talking about passive communication. So passive communication is characterized by the withholding or containing of your thoughts and emotions from others. This often leads to compensatory behavior such as avoidance, withdrawing, escaping, and this effort may stem from a desire to avoid conflict for whatever reason. Maybe you grew up in a very chaotic home, and that's how you got by. And like I was mentioning earlier at the beginning of this episode, that all behavior is learned. And when you're a kid, that may have been helpful to avoid. It may have been safe. But as you grow up, that doesn't really work in relationships. It might feel safe, but it's not necessarily effective in the long run. So it does well to respect the desires of your peers, but only at the expense of your own needs. So sometimes you might feel like avoiding conflict, keeping the peace is helpful because you're respecting others. You don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers or stir the pot. But it's not in the long run very respectful, because then things become unclear, and to be clear is to be kind. Okay, good boundaries. We'll talk more about that. And the danger of passive communication, that style, is that it creates resentment and unhealthy relationship dynamics because your needs aren't being met, right? And boundaries that are violated, those violations aren't being addressed. And so it kind of creates these skewed boundaries, which is a recipe for unhealthy, toxic relationships. Okay? So the next type of communication is aggressive communication. And aggressive communication is characterized by the forcing of one's intentions on another person. And that could also entail their thoughts and emotions on, being forced on other people. So this often is an attempt for someone to get their needs met or validated by force, right? By holding the other person captive, right? Be it guilt trips or just blunt aggressive communication. And it can be reinforced oftentimes. Unfortunately, the reason people continue with this type of communication and continue to be aggressive in how they get their needs met is because oftentimes it works. It works in the short term because eventually, the squeakiest wheel gets attention. But the flip side of that is it burns bridges. So it's not good for fostering healthy relationships. It might get your needs met eventually in the short term, but it's not really good for quality of life, if you know what I mean. All right. And other people tend to feel violated when you're aggressive with your communication because it is very forceful. All right. So the third type is assertive communication. And assertive communication is kind of the Goldilocks type of communication. It's just right. So it's characterized by the expression of your thoughts and feelings in a way that is not accusatory, nor is it accepting of blame. So I'm not blaming you. I'm not assuming blame. I'm just stating the facts and my needs and in a respectful fashion. So it's done respectfully, acknowledging both your needs and the needs and perspective of the other person. And it's most effective because it manages to grab the attention of the other person. That also brings awareness to the concern or the problem at hand. And rather than putting the other person on the defense by being accusatory, you're really eliciting their help in solving the problem. At the same time, you're acknowledging their feelings and your feelings. So it sounds tricky, right? Because it is. Oftentimes people will overcompensate. If they're used to being passive, they'll end up being more aggressive. Or if they're aggressive and they're trying to be more assertive, they'll end up being passive. And, this ebb and flow to one's end of the spectrum or the other, it's really hard to find that Goldilocks assertive communication. Some things to note about assertive communication is, like we mentioned, it respects your thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and is likely to lead to more positive mood within yourself. It also respects the thoughts, feelings, opinions of other people, which generally helps them feel more respected, and provides a more concise and clear way of expressing your needs. And when I think about assertive communication, this is really at the heart of it. When I think, how can I be assertive? It's really about being concise. You're not trying to justify your reasoning or your request or your statements with a bunch of backstory. You're really just trying to be clear and concise. And this is true with most effective communication. If somebody else wants to know more about what you're trying to state, they will elicit that from you. But you don't have to share everything out the gate. In fact, that usually turns people off. The best thing to do is to start small and concise and specific, and then extrapolate what's necessary based on their response. So it also makes getting your needs met more likely right? We all want to get what we want, and assertive communication is usually the best way to go about that. It also mitigates the probability that you'll be placed in an uncomfortable position. Now, I'm not saying that if you're, a master of assertive communication, that you're not going to have awkward moments with people. That's unfortunately unavoidable when we're talking about relationships. There's going to be uncomfortable moments. But with assertive communication, you move through that messy middle the quickest. Okay. And how to use assertive communication effectively is a little bit of an art. And some ways that can help you become more comfortable with that are understanding that it's not always comfortable, right? Just accepting that assertive communication is not usually comfortable. But the more comfortable you get with it, the easier it is to kind of anticipate that discomfort and be okay with it. It is less uncomfortable when we learn to use assertive communication than the discomfort we often experience after being aggressive, or the prolonged use of passive communication. In the long run, actually creates more discomfort than just being assertive, right? Rip the Band-Aid off. When we're assertive, it also helps orient others to what the needs are more quickly, and which helps position them better for responding, whether they can or can't help us or meet our needs, right? It helps the other person when we're clear with our communication and what we want, instead of dancing around it or walking on eggshells. All right. So there are 7 steps to making an assertive request, right? When we think about assertive communication, oftentimes it's used when we're making requests from other people to get our needs met. And the following are 7 steps in order to get our needs met with assertive communication. So step 1, identify and define your need as specific terms as possible. So using the most specific terms you can, and if you cannot articulate it for yourself, you will struggle doing so to others. So before you try to practice assertive communication, if you can think to yourself the kind of phrases or statements you'll use in defining your problem, the more clear you are with that within yourself, the easier it's going to be to communicate that to others. And vice versa. If you can't really articulate it for yourself, it's going to come out a mess on the other end when you're trying to communicate it to somebody else. Okay, step 2, locate the matches to your needs, the best matches. So I wouldn't go to my pastor for financial advice, and I wouldn't necessarily go to my CPA for spiritual advice. I mean, you could. Maybe your pastor is financially savvy, but your CPA is better positioned to provide you that kind of support. So when we're looking at getting our needs met, it's really important that we approach the best fit for that need, and also be assertive. So we have to look at the logistics of the situation as well. And decide ahead of time what words you will use. So I'm not saying that every interaction needs to be scripted, but certainly when you're asking for something, you want to be kind of very familiar with the language and how you're going to express that. So rehearsal could be very much a part of that, and especially if it's a very uncomfortable scenario, or you're having a lot of discomfort anticipating what that looks like. Okay, also if you communicate, so step 4, communicate the potential impact of how the other person's help will play out, or the impact it'll have on you, it'll be much easier to ask. Because if you can express why that person in particular you're approaching them, if they're in the best position to help you, you need to say that. You need to say why you're choosing to approach this particular person with your need. It helps orient the other person and helps them in making a decision whether they're going to take their time out to acknowledge your need. All right, step 5, acknowledge the helper's position. So if they are busy, state that you are aware of their strains. So again, acknowledging their position, that you're asking for their time, and that's no small thing. And be sure to express your gratitude for any kind of feedback they provide, even if that means no. Even if the response is no, you still want to respect that and respect their time and say as much. Because if you just turn around and get all nasty as soon as they say no, guess what? You just undid all of the work that you put in, because a no is sometimes a not right now, right? And it's good to get comfortable with no as a response when you're learning to be more assertive in your communication. Step 6, prepare yourself for compromise, okay? It's not usually a blanket yes or no on the terms that you lay out. It's usually a negotiation. So when we are asking for help, we are actually inconveniencing the other person, and we're actually working on their timeline, not ours. And we have to be prepared to meet them halfway, right? So in that spirit, it's really important to remember not to wait until the last minute when you're asking for help, right? Do not wait until something is in critical condition or there's a due date or a deadline on top of you before you ask for help. A failure to plan on your part does not constitute a crisis on somebody else's part. I say that in the most loving way. I try and practice this myself. I've been in plenty of positions where I've waited to the last minute and I've had to inconvenience somebody else. But it's important to remember that's not on them, that's on you. And so when you're coming to somebody else, you need to slow your roll, calm down, and approach them as calmly as possible, and not in a state of panic, okay? And acknowledge that. If you waited the last minute, acknowledge that. Be like, I know it's not fair to you that I waited until the last minute to ask you this, but I'm really in a pickle, and if you can help me out this time, I won't put you in this position again, and I'm going to be more prompt when asking for help. And people really respect that when we own our own behavior. So, how you can exercise this and put this into practice, you could write out an example of an assertive request, right? As a way to even just role play with yourself. You can identify an unmet need or desire of something that you want to ask for, and then decide the best person you can approach in asking for help assertively. And then third, you want to choose your words ahead of time. So how you want to come across, and that includes your tone, your posture, the environment, the setting, and be sure to communicate why it's important and how it would make you feel if this need was met. Okay? So that's the communication styles. Now we're going to touch on one of the final aspects of healthy communication that I'm trying to lay out for you here, and that is learning how to articulate and frame your thoughts and feelings using assertive communication. Okay? So assertiveness, it's really defined by the ability to accurately communicate your thoughts and feelings, positive or negative, and truthfully, with a relaxed demeanor, right? Not aggressive, not posturing, but very relaxed, humble, and in a respectful dialogue with the other person. This also applies to setting boundaries when you are not comfortable with committing to something. Assertive expression starts with I statements. I feel, such as I feel sad when you ignore me. I feel upset or angry when you speak to me that way. Or I think statements. I think we need to spend some more quality time together. I think we should have more time alone to focus on our personal interests. Or I think you are accusing me of something that is not my fault. It's okay to say what you think, and it's okay to say what you feel, right? It's how we say that, right? Again, that we're not being accusatory. We're simply stating our feelings in real time, our thoughts in real time, without judgment. Okay? The same rule applies when we're expressing or making requests. You need to know that you are feeling and think. You need to know what you're feeling and thinking before you say it, before you approach somebody. So the real take-home point with this is that we need to be in touch with our own feelings in order to express those to other people. And you need to know why is it important to express these things? Why is it important for this other person to know how you feel? Why is it important for this other person to understand your thought process behind it? Oftentimes, relationships get in trouble because we just want the other person to be psychic. Well, you've been married to me for 10 years. Don't you know that by now? Or why don't you know that? I mean, nobody appreciates being spoken to that way, and it's not realistic. Nobody is psychic. And if you want to have healthy relationships, we need to really get in the habit of being better communicators. So know if you'll be asking for something in response to your thoughts and feelings, and if you simply need to communicate them to gain mutual understanding. And if your goal is to get something in return, remember to be clear, kind, and concise. And remember to always have an attitude of gratitude, expressing your understanding and appreciation of the position of your audience and that you're using their time. Even if it's somebody that you are married to, that's in your family, or that you feel you're already, they're obligated to you, that's not very effective. If you come at it with that kind of position that they have to hear you out because they're your spouse or child or whatever, you still want to respect their time, right? Because that's what you would want from them, right? So the golden rule. Okay. How can you put that piece into practice? You could write out an expression of your thoughts and feelings. So you could create a hypothetical scenario in which you wish to communicate your thoughts and feelings to another person. And this could be a particular individual you're already having unresolved issues with. And you could try and pick out the words you would use specifically. Think about what kind of words would I use to express how I'm feeling about this situation with this particular person. And you may have to do this draft a few times because maybe the initial language isn't kind, or maybe it doesn't really communicate what's really going on, right? Especially if there's a lot of resentment built up. And part of the reason we want to write these things out and rehearse them is so that we don't end up using aggressive language or passive language when we actually approach the person. And what do you anticipate their reaction will be? This is really important. How do you envision their reaction toward you based on history? And how do you suppose they would feel in response to your approach to them and your expression, right? So empathy is really important. All right. And lastly, I want to talk about the importance of identifying areas for potential growth in your interpersonal skill set, right? Your people skills, where do you need some work? Even if you feel that you have good communication and good conflict resolution skills, there's always room for improvement. As a therapist, I still work hard to identify points of intervention for personal growth because I want to have the best quality of life I can have, and I want to bring the best quality to the relationships around me that I can. And I'm always working on my communication for improving my relationships, regardless of how good I think they already are. We learn to identify areas of growth by reflecting on our own experience, our own lived experience, and our own mistakes. And we seek to inform those future decisions by improving upon those areas, which also improve our relationships, our conflict resolution skills, our how we choose to spend our time with other people. And I feel the key here is to really know what vehicle works best when we're saturating new information in order to stay inspired and to keep learning. For me, I am definitely a podcast guy. That's why I started my own podcast. I love absorbing information in an audio fashion because I can go for a walk or a bike ride or while I'm driving or I'm doing the laundry. I just love podcasts. That's why I started my own podcast. But I understand that not everybody absorbs information the best that way. Some people are very visual. That's why I started this YouTube channel. So it's important to find out how you best digest information and then make active decisions, proactive decisions about the areas that you want to improve upon and start saturating through whatever vehicle that is that works best for you. Okay. Now, just some key points. So just in summary, to recap what we discussed in this episode, first of all, you can improve the way you communicate with others, right? You can always improve. And this will in turn improve the quality of your relationships as you learn to be a better communicator. Second, you can use different types of targeted communications depending on the nature of the relationship and the need. All right. Thirdly, you can learn to practice active listening and understand that it's a salient skill that will improve all of your relationships, regardless of the dynamic and the nature of that relationship, as you get better at it. And lastly, learning to use assertive communication and making requests and setting boundaries will help to secure, improve, and maintain healthy relationships for the rest of your life. And as a result, your quality of life improves because, like I said earlier on, relationships tend to be the thorn in the flesh of everybody's mood lability and satisfaction level in their worldview and their marriage and relationships in general. So the better you get at communicating, the better your mood is going to be on average. And that's a huge implication, right? All right. So hopefully this was helpful. Communication is one of those things that we all need to work on, that we can all improve upon. If you want to provide me any feedback, please do comment on this episode, subscribe, let me know if you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment below, like, subscribe, let me know your thoughts. If you're listening to this on my podcast, same, please do subscribe, let me know in the comments or in the contact me form link in the description if there's anything you'd like me to speak to more directly around communication or relationships or any content in general, as I am really on a mission to kind of teach you actionable skills and information on how to just have the best life that you can, but specifically around improving your mood and quality of life. Okay? So, little disclaimer, yes, I am a licensed therapist, but this is for entertainment purposes only. This is not, this video or podcast or this information does not constitute a client-therapist relationship. And if you need a professional, you should get one. And if you need some help with that, jump over to Psychology Today, Therapist Finder, or you can go over to the NAMI referral line and they can point you in the right direction. Okay, thank you so much for your support. Please, if you found this helpful, share it. Get the word out there, as I'm on a mission to raise mental health awareness, and I can't do it without your help. All right, thank you so much. You take care. Bye-bye now.